Collin, and tell us what's going on here.
Yeah, I want to bring in Collin Laverty. He's the president of Cuban Educational Travel, as you mentioned, Ali. And, you know, a lot to digest here. We both heard the president's speech. There's a lot still in flux right now because these regulations are being hammered out over the next 30 days or so. But you've already made a change in your business just yesterday. Tell me what that was.
Well, you'll see a big part of these changes. The Trump administration are focused on military companies in Cuba and their involvement in the tourism sector. So we immediately moved about 25 different reservations that we had at hotels that do have clear linkages to the military to other hotels.
And to be clear, that's over the next 6 months because one of these restrictions now is that you cannot, Americans are prohibited, even if they're here on something that's allowed, on a type of visa that's allowed, they can't spend money on a hotel that has any direct ties to the military. That's very tough to do in Cuba, of course, because so much of this economy is tied to the Cuban military.
Exactly. So we'll have to see how it's implemented. I think if it's a broad prohibition on economic activity with companies that are involved in the military, I mean, you can't buy a bottle of water, but sometimes you can't grab a taxi. So it'll be, we'll have to see the details when they come out. I think most importantly, though, is this is supposedly focused on the military and on the Cuban state, but if you look at the details of the policy changes, one of the things that it prohibits are from individual travelers coming here on their own. They're the ones staying in private homes, private restaurants, private taxis. So you're essentially making the private sector in Cuba suffer.
So our tour group's going to be able to come in and stay at a B&B, like the president said, that would be trying to encourage.
In some cases, but it's going to be logistically difficult. So, in actuality, they'll probably move from a military-run hotel to a state-owned hotel. The money goes to the same place. What's the difference? I think the big difference is they're not going to be staying at the B&B. They're going away from that, and they're going to state-run hotels.
Now, Ali, let me bring you in here.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
Yeah.
I know some of the other companies here. Go ahead.
I wanted to go down that road with Collin because one of the things that the president's defenders on this are saying is that we were expecting this major travel boom to Cuba. All the airlines started flights to Cuba, and then they all sort of canceled them. Why did that happen? Why did this tourist boom not manifest as expected?
Well, I think if you look at it within the context of U.S. travel to Cuba, there's been a huge boom. We went from less than 100,000 Americans traveling per year to 300,000, 400,000 Americans traveling per year to Cuba. You have another 300,000, 400,000 Cuban Americans traveling. We're now the second largest source of travel to Cuba. So there certainly has been a boom. There's still serious restrictions on travel to Cuba. There's 12 categories. When those 12 categories are lifted and anyone can travel, most estimates show it'll be 1 to 2 million Americans per year.
And Collin, do you think that these restrictions will scare off travelers from coming? Is this essentially hitting the brakes on them? That's what some of the critics of this policy say.
I mean, I think that'll be the biggest effect. Essentially we're getting to a point where there was a sense of normalcy on booking a ticket, reserving an Airbnb, reserving a hotel, and going to Cuba. Psychologically, Americans were finally coming to the conclusion it's okay to go to Cuba. And the message today, which was filled with ideology, emotion, and everything else you could characterize the scene in Miami, the message that it sends is you can't go to Cuba. You're going to be audited, you're going to have people tracking you down, and you're going to get in trouble. So that's going to kill demand.
Ali?
Do you see this changing, Collin? Do you think there's a way to adapt to this? Because in regimes that are not particularly free all over the world, there's remarkable government state involvement in the tourism industry. So you made an interesting mention that maybe something will move out of being military controlled into being state controlled. Is that what you do? You think Cuba will adapt in a way that will continue to allow people to go there and do business?
I think Cuba has been changing, within its own context, at its own pace, and it'll continue to change. I think that anyone who understands Cuba and U.S. policy towards Cuba, finger-pointing and telling the Cuban government what to do has exactly the adverse effect. So do I think this will be effective policy? Absolutely not. Is this policy popular? No. 66% of Republicans oppose travel restrictions, 75% of all Americans, and over 2/3 of Cuban Americans. So I think really the only people that support this policy are the folks that were in that auditorium today.
What a good discussion. I appreciate you shedding some light on it for us, Collin. And Gabe Gutierrez, your great reporting from Havana. Thanks very much for joining us for this discussion. Collin Laverty is the